Welcome back. And we've turned the camera around to the other side of the gallery. And we've referenced these paintings in a bit. So in these, you kind of came up with these as you started talking more about Rothko and the Rothko Chapel. So talk a little bit about the fact that they're triptychs, the compositional arrangement with the difference in elevations and what have you, in terms of what you're trying to get at. And then also the palettes. I noticed the palettes are discernibly different than over here. And so why don't you try and cover, sort of what you're trying to achieve, in these. And there's 3 of these, correct?
Yeah, there's 3 of these.
And so 2 are up right now, and then another one is sort of in parts over here. So,
as I was referencing the previous video, this show, part of it is highly influenced by Rothko and the Rothko Chapel. And so I've done different bodies of work where there's an entry point, where I definitely, like I was mentioning, the shape of time, and where an artist is in their work in relation to prime examples, original ideas. And so this works, I think, their originality lies in their formal way that they're made. In their aesthetic kind of appearance, I think someone who's interested in art history is going to say, oh, these are kind of like Rothko's work or something like that, because it's very overt. Not all of them, maybe not the one behind you, but the ones that we looked at before that were really vertical, and these in particular. And it's, I've done this with Jasper Johns, with Daniel Buren, with a lot of other artists in particular, where I'll use something in the same way in history. Early Western painting, there would be religious imagery would be kind of an ideal subject, the most elevated, and below that would be portraiture, and then still life and landscape.
These feel very alterish because of the triptych nature and the elevation in the center, and so they have a a feel of being like an altar piece.
Well, what I was mentioning in that aspect, the relation to subject in early painting, people weren't inventing something. They would do a crucifixion and they'd do these scenes. And so artists were just interpreting that and often referencing previous artists' work, like Rubens would maybe do a variation that he saw of a Da Vinci. And so we have an idea of what a lost Da Vinci painting looks like because Rubens saw it and did his kind of variation of it. So what I'm doing essentially is part of the subject that I'm doing is using kind of artist's work to a degree, because all this work, even though I mentioned landscape and all these things in the Sublime, it's very art about art to a degree, and so I'm very aware of it, and like I mentioned in the previous video, but I'm just stated here, is that these are highly influenced by the Rothko Chapel. And so what that was it was the last work that Rothko did. And I remember, I'm always looking at a lot of things, and I saw a picture of him in his studio. It was really close to Hunter College, and he's standing there next to the painting, and it's just like, God, that's just great. That's what every artist kind of, I don't know every artist, but for me, very appealing. And living here in Manhattan, it's a little challenging now to get a giant studio like that and make these pieces. And these pieces are so big, they don't fit through the door. So you actually have to fold them in half, and it's a very arduous process. And they look really simple like this. So the number of paintings, the number of canvases corresponded. And so he built this, I think it's an octagon-shaped structure. It exists in Texas. It was funded by the Nebulous. He built it in concert with the architect Philip Johnson. And so there was a site-specific project. He committed suicide and never saw it realized. And so kind of part of that is like, I'm thinking about that work, and God, I'd love to do something like that. And it's like, well, why don't you? Like all the things you're doing, why don't you do it? So I kind of bring that into my work. So the gallery here, we looked at previously these giant vertical pieces that I always like to do things site-specific. Maybe it doesn't make the most sense, but to make a nice show. And so those verticals like that. So these pieces over here, in Rothko's kind of orientation, the structure was built specifically for it, and all the walls are like even. So the proportions aren't exactly the same in terms of scale because they don't relate to the gallery, but I proportion a piece like this to the wall of the gallery. So that's how I have kind of dealt with the scale. You mentioned also the altar kind of reference. So I feel like when you put three pieces together, it has the quality of a triptych, which is a religious painting that would fold, and they were portable paintings that would also then be copied and they'd be sent around throughout Europe. Also, a lot of them historically, not a lot of them, but they did have this step kind of quality. That's something else that existed. And then so in terms of the palette, the one behind David was the first really large one that I did like this. And the previous video I was mentioning someone like Whistler. I think it's incredibly subtle. I don't know if it's going to come up on the camera. Sometimes I think it's probably one of the best paintings I've ever done. It's strange because it's so incredibly subtle, but it's just very rewarding because of what I mentioned before with the rods and the cones. And the more you look at it, the more you really see
yeah, this one definitely has a lot more yellow in it.
And it doesn't, these pieces, because they kind of read like shaped canvases, they feel a bit, it's bizarre that something can seem kind of, it's a bit more militaristic almost, the battleship kind of color. But this is a very soft, very light kind of touch in this painting. And I think maybe what happened to me was to physically do these, there's a real kind of aggressive masculinity that kind of like maybe tied to Abeck's painting. But I just had a little baby. So when you're taking care of a little baby, you need to have like a soft, kind of gentle touch in what you're doing. And so I try to do that in the surface. And I think that's what kind of comes across, especially the color in these. In these, they're a lot darker. They have the same quality, but it's very light. Maybe the ground color is dark, or maybe they're more blue. These two kind of are almost like a pair. The other one is a lot more red. And when I first started doing these, I like to do them in pairs, almost like Joe Bear paintings, because I like the idea that I've always been interested in sculpture and object. And so I feel like a modernist painting is kind of like, this is the one. So when you have two together, it kind of contradicts that to a degree. And as you're working as an artist, you think, okay, trying to make them that work together. But it's not really necessarily easy. I'm not trying to mechanically make them work together. So I had this humongous studio, so I'm painting these really at the same time, almost like muscle memory and dance, where you're trying not to think about it, you're trying to just go, so that they kind of are corresponding colors. But the more I look at them, they're the same palette too, but there's variation between the subtle areas of blue and yellow and red.
Does the center stand off further, or is it a different thickness from the wall?
I think it's because the way that we bracket them to there, so it wants
gotcha.
to kind of push out a little bit, but it's easier to hang and have them
gotcha.
Nice and straight.
Okay.
But I mean, definitely the altar kind of quality is very accurate with the shape kind of quality of these. There's also something that kind of feels figurative because it's like a larger center in the two sides. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they're kind of a nice contrast to these paintings over here. And standing over here and looking at them from a distance, they read very different. That's the other thing too is, with a lot of this sort of work, it's, and we were just talking about this upstairs with another artist in another video that we were doing today. The one thing, internet's great and all the imagery and everything, but at the end of the day though, you just can't get, you can't really capture, and even not really with a video, because sometimes you don't know what's real or a glare, an artifact of moving a camera around and things like that. Sorry, Yao. But, these read very differently from side to side. even though this is uniformly lit and they're not spot lit, and it's because of the pixelation, I think. It's more so than, well, even with brush painting, you still get that effect too. Especially if it's impasto, because then you have cast shadows and you have other things that are happening depending on where you're standing. But these do read much more dynamically from this side than that side, which is kind of interesting. And I guess I didn't notice that when they were up earlier in this at the end of the summer. But from this perspective now, they read much lighter and less gray than they did from the other side of the room, which is sort of interesting. But again, it just gets to even though these are very, seemingly minimal and reductive, at a glance, like all good painting, there's a high degree of complexity, and it's very experiential, to realize that. And when you look at like monochromes, you don't get the depth of how they were constructed. And the sort of nuance in the way the artist applied the paint, or what paint they chose, or the sheen, or there's so many other factors that come in that when you look at it, it's like, oh, that's just sort of an aqua colored painting or whatever. But then when you see it in person, you get all these reflections, you get shadows, you get from different angles, you see different things depending upon, like here, there's a certain amount of texture on these paintings. Yeah. And you're getting a different read depending on where you were standing and applying it relative to other sort of pixels, if you were, of paint that were already there. And so they read different from this side than from that side. So either cooler, warmer, or whatever. Yeah,
they're really like gestural paintings. It's just the contrast is turned way down.
Yeah.
So it's not,
and so
walking
when you
over
see
the
them
head.
in person, they're way more dynamic. And like standing here now, I don't know if it's just my eyes today, but the bottom definitely looks very purple. The way the blue and the red is sort of blended. Are you seeing that? It's like these it's almost like how your stove top, the gas has that sort of bluey purple.
It's definitely that. So that's what I was talking about, where it takes a little while for your eye to adjust, and then what happens is as you look away, your eye adjusts back again. It's like as if you're walking in a bright and dark room, so your eye kind of needs to adjust to it, and then you kind of capture it. It doesn't happen just instantly because you kind of need a moment. And so also the first one that I did like this is like hanging above my bed, and I really like it because it's a very subtle painting and it's not like screaming at you. And so there's a certain point as an artist, I think all those academic, historical things I'm very interested in, I wanted those, aspects and illusions to be my work. But also at the end of the day, you think, oh, am I doing this in a vacuum? Who really cares? I would just do some paintings that I really like, And so it's just a painting that's very nice, that I enjoy being with, and it doesn't, it rewards me the more I look at it, and that's what I want out of a great piece of art.
Yeah, the colors really are spectacular. I do like them much better from this side. I don't know why it would be different. I'll examine that actually when the daylight, because we have daylight coming from that side.
I think what happens is when I'm doing them flat.
Right.
So I'm spraying at an angle. So as if like say in the summer we had some fluorescent ones, and as you stand, like if I'm looking at this painting, I'm standing in front of it.
Right.
The color is going to be compressed in a different way, and as I stand more and more and more, all the color gets compressed this way,
right.
And then it looks like ultra fluorescent, almost like a line. Whereas if you go this way,
that's what I'm thinking it is from that angle, from the ones I was looking at. They look much warmer and more yellow from this side than that side, and it was probably where you were standing relative to how that was getting laid down, that last bit of paint. And that hugely affects, I think, the angle. But at the end of the day, though, it is the color mixing in your eye that we're observing here. And we're not really seeing really how the paint's laid down. It's how we are reacting to the totality of all the paint built up on there, and how the light's affecting it. And these probably read a little bit different in different kinds of light, I would imagine.
Yeah.
So I know in the daylight, that one is very much more radiant when the sun's coming through that window. and now it's nighttime, and we're, you know, evening. And so you're not really getting all that abundance of light and the ricocheting of light in the room, but but they're very dramatic. I sure hope people do come and see them in person. The videos are really nice and everything, and the images are quite spectacular, but I do think the experience of the
paintings
scale,
are meant to be seen in person.
These are really well worth the trip to see them while they're up, for sure. And even these too, because these read very differently in different angles and perspectives. And they're very, the surfaces on these seem very different. They're like sort of suede-y, satiny, something going on that you don't see so much over here. And maybe it's the fact that they're more neutral and less tilting towards one color or the other.
It's a different canvas. There's a different way that I did the paint. I repainted these several times. And since they're bigger, the canvas is a harder grade canvas, and I sprayed them several times. And some of it has to do with the conditions I was working in, kind of in that studio, and trying to kind of create a piece like this. You know, I was in a building, and it was almost like a squat, really. Like it was like they were, you know,
it was hot and humid.
Worked it out, and
the windows were open.
Yeah, and they were going to tear the building down, and I really had. It was coming down to the wire, trying to finish it, and I kind of had already finished a body of work, that kind of brighter version. But in my gut, that was like, I want to do this body of work too. I want to get that. So I was really pushing, and so they're not as refined as, like, say, this one behind you. They're more. There's more of a sense of urgency and immediacy to do. And these smaller ones are a different canvas because of the scale.
I don't get that sense at all. It's just they're three very, oddly to say this, because they're practically, you know, neutral and monochrome, or whatever the words we've been throwing around tonight. But they, when you stand from here, I mean, they're and you're around them more. They're really three very different compositions.
Yeah.
So it's quite different. This one has that very distinct blue that you only see a little bit up there, but that has a lot more yellow and red. It's almost like flames in the center, whereas this reads more landscape. And that one is just sort of more subtly melded, the one in the middle, you know, and it doesn't really read any particular way. But yeah, it's just interesting to see the vast difference, and given that they all sort of started out of your thoughts around atmospheric, you know, landscape painting. And so it's kind of interesting how they sort of morphed and changed. But now, as we've said, you've picked up a lot of other sort of references and ideas while doing the research around this, and looking at it more expansively than just the last 150 years in art, you know, in painting. I
love art history. I'm always looking at it. And then, so I was kind of aware and thinking about these things before I started doing these paintings. And I think the research is kind of to really kind of make an annotated historical, you know, do it properly, but put the references so other people can see it, you know. So it's not just like working in a vacuum, or as if, you know, I'm not aware of it, you know. So it's almost like a visual bibliography in a way.
No, it's nice. Well, I hope everybody comes and takes a look at the show, and thank you very much. Congratulations, they're quite spectacular.
Thanks a lot.
And this isn't even all of them.
Supporting the arts, and, you know, letting artists like myself do the shows like this. So if you enjoyed, please like and subscribe and support this gallery so they can keep putting on great shows like this.
I second that.